In this interactive video, we will lay down some of the essentials of Islam. So here we go. So first, just a little bit of background. Islam was actually known as Muhammadanism until the mid-60s. And the word Islam is derived from the root SLM, which means both peace and surrender. So it's the peace that comes when one's life is surrendered to God. And this is a quote to kind of set the tone for the next section here. This was from American columnist Meg Greenfield in 1979, who said, "No part of the world is more hopelessly and systematically and stubbornly misunderstood by us than that complex of religion, culture, and geography known as Islam." So, Philip Hitti was a Lebanese American professor and scholar at Princeton and Harvard, and he had this to say about Islam. "Around the name of the Arabs gleams that halo which belongs to the world conquerors. Within a century after their rise, this people became the masters of an empire extending from the shores of the Atlantic Ocean to the confines of China, an empire greater than that of Rome at its zenith. In this period of unprecedented expansion, they assimilated to their creed, speech, and even physical type more aliens than any stock before or since, not excepting the Hellenic, the Roman, the Anglo-Saxon, or the Russian." So essentially, Philip Hitti is saying um, you can't, it's hard to overemphasize the importance of the Arabic culture and its cultural and technological contributions to the world. So I thought this would be an interesting to just show or remind everybody of that essentially Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all share a common, father, essentially, which was Abraham. So Abraham was the founder of Judaism about, over 4,000 years ago now. Um, he had a wife named Sarah. Sarah had a servant named Hagar, who Abraham had relations with, right? So Abraham and Sarah had Isaac, right? And from throughout this lineage came eventually Moses, the prophet who received the Ten Commandments, and then down through this lineage eventually came Jesus, right? But Abraham also had relations with his servant, his wife's servant Hagar. They had a child named Ishmael, right? And then after Isaac was born, eventually they had Isaac too. Um, right, Isaac over here, notice. Hagar and Ishmael cast him out and sent him back to Arab lands. Um, and then eventually down the line came Muhammad. So you can see how, really closely related these three religions are, whether people believe it, really think it or not, or let's say whether adherents to each of these religions behave like it or not. They're all very closely related. So the seal of the prophets, who was, according to Islam, Muhammad. And Muhammad was born around 570 um, current era or AD, right? And the word Muhammad, the name, translates to highly praised. And so throughout his lifetime, he was a bunch of different stuff. He was a shepherd, he was a merchant, a hermit, an exile, a soldier, a lawmaker, a prophet, priest, king, mystic, and also an orphan. And prophets had come before him. Remember the common lineage that he shares. So, you know, there had been Jeremiah, there had been Isaiah and Ezekiel, right? For instance, Jesus. But Muhammad, according to Islam, is considered the culmination of all of their efforts. Hence, the seal of the prophets, right? Like, we don't, that's the end of the prophets. Seal them off because it was Muhammad. Um, so during Muhammad's time, the Arab world was in disarray. There was extreme tribalism, the scarcity of the desert. There was political deadlock in Mecca, accompanied by generally decadent behavior on behalf of the citizenry, like drunken orgies and gambling and thievery and cynicism and stuff like that. There was also animistic polytheism. So people believed the desert was populated with these terrible spirits called jinn, and that's actually where we get the word genie from. Um, and these jinn like inspired neither exaltation nor moral restraint. They were just these terrible spirits that got under people's skins, apparently, right? So things weren't so good, and conditions were ripe for change, in other words. So before we continue with Muhammad, we ought to mention that the concept of Allah was the God in Islam, the one, the only, and without rival. Because in early Muhammad's time, in the in his geographical area, he was just one amongst others, right? Remember, there was polytheism in what would have been called Arabia, right? At the time, that whole general area practiced polytheism, and Allah was just one of them, right? But and so this is why it'll be critical. Muhammad elevated Allah over the others and essentially said, "This is the God, the one, the only, has no rival." So, in other words, Muhammad put an end to polytheism in the area. And, there's this a phrase, um, I'll do my best. La ilaha, la ilaha illa la. There is no God but God. In other words, but Allah. So at around 610 current era or AD, Muhammad received his commission. So it was the same command that had fallen earlier on Abraham, Moses, Samuel, Isaiah, and Jesus. The archangel Gabriel took the form of a man and said to Muhammad, "Proclaim." And at that point, and from then on, Muhammad's life was not his any longer, right? From that time onward, Muhammad's life belonged to Allah and to all of humanity, preaching the words that Allah was to transmit for 23 years and do so in the face of relentless persecution, insult, and outrage. And it's said that these words became the Koran. And Muhammad claimed that only one miracle, that he could only perform and only did perform one miracle, and that is of um, the Quran itself. And at first, he made very few converts. It's like by the end of a decade of his mission, he had only several hundred families believed that he was Allah's authentic spokesman. So it didn't catch on that quickly in the beginning. He had a lot of work ahead of him. Then we have the migration that led to victory for the for Muslims, for the Islamic religion. Um, so Muhammad was suddenly anticipated by a delegation of the leading citizens of Yathrib, which is a city 280 miles to Mecca's north. They wanted him to move his ministry to their city. They caught wind of him down in Mecca and said, "Bring your ministry up here to uh, Yathrib," which is now Medina here. So um, Muhammad received a sign from Allah to accept that charge in 622. And this migration is known as the Hijra, and it's regarded by Muslims as the turning point in world history. And then Yathrib uh, soon came to be known as Medina, like I said, which translates to the city. And Muhammad died in 632 with virtually all of Arabia under his control. So the standing miracle, and the standing miracle is essentially the means the only and enduring miracle is the Quran, and it's perhaps the most recited and read book in the world. And Muhammad considered it Allah's standing miracle. Um, it consists of 114 chapters or surahs, and it's said from the book that the created Quran is the formal crystallization of the infinite reality of the uncreated Quran. So, on the one hand, there's infinite reality, right? The spirit world, if you will, of the uncreated Quran that has always been, right? It's not referring to the book here, this infinite, referring to this infinite reality or the way things are and the way they ought to be is essentially the infinite reality of the uncreated Quran. The created Quran, the book, is the formal, is it laid down on paper in a formal manner? That's the meaning of those words. So it came to Muhammad in manageable segments over 23 years, beginning as multiple voices, but then eventually coalescing into a single voice that identified itself as Gabriel's, right? Allah's angel of revelation. And the revelations were recorded onto whatever was handy by Muhammad's followers, because Muhammad himself, it's thought by historians and theologians that he was actually illiterate. And the Quran is, in a sense, a continuation of the Old and New Testaments, in a sense, and presents itself as their culmination, right? Like there's all this stuff, but it was working towards and eventually became the Quran. So the Quran is notoriously a mysterious and challenging, let's say, document, um, especially to Europeans. So, on the impenetrability of the Quran, this has been said. So, Thomas Carlyle, who was a 19th century Scottish philosopher, historian, and mathematician, said this: "As toilsome reading as I ever undertook, a wearisome, confused jumble, crude, incandite. Nothing but a sense of duty could carry any European through the Quran." Right? And then Edward Gibbon, who was an 18th century English historian. Some of you may know him because he wrote the history of the Roman Empire. Um, and he said, "The European will peruse with impatience its endless incoherent rhapsody of fable and precept and declamation, which seldom excites a sentiment or idea, which sometimes crawls in the dust and is sometimes lost in the clouds." So another um, typical early, Enlightenment era, Age of Reason era perspective on the Quran. But then back to Philip Hitti, who says, essentially reminds people that no people in the world are so moved by the word, spoken or written, as the Arabs. Hardly any language seems capable of exercising over the minds of its users such irresistible influence as Arabic. Right? So, in other words, what Philip Hitti is pointing out that the power of the Quran is lost on people who don't speak Arabic, or tends to be. Also, the Quran is unlike any other religious text with respect to its content. So, unlike the Upanishads, for instance, and the Indian epics, the Quran's not explicitly metaphysical and it doesn't ground its theology in these big, epic, dramatic narratives. And unlike the Old Testament, it doesn't ground its theology in these grand historical narratives. So where the Old and New Testaments are like directly historical, but then indirectly doctrinal, the way that they tell the stories, they tell it as if something's happened in history, and then they impart the doctrine through that story. The Quran is directly doctrinal and indirectly historical. So the Quran speaks at you in doctrine, and then the history you kind of tease out of it. Right? So because of this, historical facts and chronology are of minor importance, um, within the Quran. And also in the Quran, Allah speaks in the first person. So the God of where the God of the Old and New Testaments is much more distant. His voice is more distant by comparison. So now for some of the basic theological concepts of Islam. So with few striking exceptions, the basic theological concepts of Islam are virtually identical with those of Judaism and Christianity, right? And we'll take a look at God, creation, the human self, and the day of judgment, respectively. So God, or Allah, mhm. So the Quran's innovation was to remove idols from the religious scene and focus the divine in a single God for everyone. The Quran's historical um, religious innovation. So remember that Judaism removed idols from the religious scene, but its teachings were confined to the people of Israel. And Christians, essentially, or at least logically, compromised their monotheism by deifying Christ. So the Quran depicts Allah's nature as awesome, of infinite power, and of great mercy. And again, without idols, without national or tribal exclusivity, and also without having like any other I don't want to just say any other deities, because we understand from Christianity that God the Son and the Holy Spirit are facets of the same thing, right? But nobody else is deified. Like Muhammad wasn't deified in the way that Christ was. Um, so that was the Quran's essential innovation. Then about creation. So the creation of everything, right? The world is presented as created by a deliberate act of Allah's will and as the handiwork of a perfect God. The material world must likewise be good. If Allah's will is, if Allah is perfect, then only perfect things can come from Him, is the idea. So Since Allah is perfect, the material world must likewise be perfect and good. Um, and they've got a very similar Adam and Eve story, though Eve isn't mentioned by name. She's referred to as Adam's wife, and that's not a typo. That would be the Arabic spelling of Adam, right? Very similar creation story. Um, and on the human self, um, under Islam, foremost among God's creations is the human self, which is fundamentally good. So we are entitled to self respect and a healthy self image. And our nature is not tainted by original sin and the fall, right? So, unlike um, Christianity, for instance, and Judaism. So, the closest Islam comes to the Christian doctrine of original sin is in its concept of ghafla. I did my best with that, or forgetting. Mm. So instead of original sin, where the idea behind original sin is that Eve ate of the tree of knowledge, and this essentially estranged her Adam and all of humanity from God. They were alienated from one another at that time, right? So the closest that Islam comes to that concept is forgetting, right? People forget their divine origin, and this mistake needs to be corrected repeatedly. We have to constantly be reminded, um, because we forget, and we forget all the time. We become enmeshed in earthly matters and material wants and needs and desires, and we forget our divine origin, and we need constant reminder. So goes the idea. Um, so when you acknowledge life as a gift from the Creator, you have two obligations that come along with it. The first is that you have to have gratitude for the life that you've received. And the word infidel actually means one who lacks gratitude in this sense. And also, another obligation is a sense of surrender or commitment where nothing is withheld from the divine. This is essentially what you owe your life. You owe this to God, Allah, the Creator, for having given you life. And then two more features of the human self are its extreme individuality, right? So each person's absolute uniqueness and the responsibility that this entails is impressed upon the followers of Muslims, right? Um, our distinctness is most acutely realized on the day of judgment, which we'll talk about in a second. And another feature of the human self is the issue of the soul's freedom and absolute personal responsibility. So, the day of judgment, Yom al-Din, um, is essentially the tearing away of all illusions of security that characterizes the doctrine of the Last Judgment and its anticipation in the Quran. Right? That's what the Day of Judgment amounts to. And depending on how it fares in its reckoning, how your soul fares in its reckoning on this day, it'll go to either the heavens or the hells. Like you don't just quietly slip away when you die, right? On the day of your reckoning. You either go to the heavens or the hells. It's one or the other. So, God, creation, the human self, and the day of judgment, all of these that we just discussed, are the chief theological pegs on which the Quran's teachings hang. And in spite of the importance of these four chief theological pegs, of the Quran. Um, the Quran's a book which emphasizes deed over idea. What you should do as opposed to what you should think. Okay, so in this video, we covered a little bit of the background of Islam, the seal of the prophets, which was essentially another way of referring to Muhammad, the migration that led to victory for the religion, the standing miracle, which is the Quran in Islam, and a few of the basic theological concepts.